Russia and the shadow of empire. So the shadow of empire, the shadow of the past onto the present, the shadow of nefarious Russia cast across helpless Europe, or is it the shadow of Russia in the American election? Maria Teresa, would you like to begin, please?
Yeah. Thank you. First of all, I want to thank you for the invitation and for the numerous suggestions I received during your presentation today and yesterday, particularly regarding the concepts we talked about yesterday, the concept of order, rebellion, inside empire. I'm a historian of modern history, contemporary history, so I will, in my presentation, I will read, also for not wasting time. And I will talk about the attempts of Russian and Soviet empire to exert its influence in the Mediterranean area, particularly in the Balkan area and the Italian area. In recent years, historical research has been enriched by numerous sources coming from archives of the former Soviet Union. Although Russian documents are not always available, it depends on the political situation, it depends on Putin's attitude towards the West. Nevertheless, a major source of information regarding certain aspects of modern history are now better known, and so it helps very much, these archives help very much Western scholars to know better, particularly the Stalinist era. The picture that emerges from an analysis of the new documentation is more complex than what could have been imagined, particularly as concerns the Stalinist period. During the Cold War, the clarification of the objectives and the actions to be undertaken in various European countries where communist regimes were intended to be established was dictated by practical considerations and by the development of the same idea of the Soviet Empire. In addition, USSR indirectly aimed at influencing foreign as well as internal policy in countries such as Italy, which did not belong to the Soviet sphere. As concerns the Tsarist empire, it was a typical territorial empire, typical continental empire, not ideological, not economic, which at the same time was the largest state in Europe, in the world, and one of the European powers. Although, if compared to European countries, it was very backward from a socio-political and economic point of view. The Tsarist regime survived the 1905 revolution and the defeat against Japan, with whom the Tsar managed to sign a peace treaty and managed to lose few territories. Anyway, the defeat with Japan shocked Europe. Shocked the European powers, since it demonstrated that the empire, the Soviet, one of the most important empires in Europe, the third three empires, was very weak. As regards the beginning of the 20th century, Russian foreign policy was conditioned by three elements. First, the accession of Russia to the entente with France and Great Britain. Second, its aggressive attitude towards the Ottoman and the Austro-Hungarian empires. And third, the traditional expansionist policy of Russian autocracy aimed at obtaining an outlet to the Mediterranean. So it was important, the relations with Serbia, and so part of the Ottoman Empire. These were also the reasons why the Russian Empire entered the war in 1914. The Russian participation at war was useful both for attacking two empires and eventually destroying them, and second, for reaching the Mediterranean as a trusted ally of Serbia. All these plans were not realized, since according to Viktor Zaslavsky, the history of the last years of Russian Empire is the history of the regime in decomposition, unable to govern, that did not want to either reform or voluntarily leave the power, dragging to the edge the entire country. So the history of the Russian Empire and its end is strictly connected with the First World War, which encouraged and facilitated the outbreak of revolution. On the other hand, in terms of domestic policy, through the entrance at war, the Russian leadership aimed at cracking down once and for all the revolutionary movement and strikes, which began in 1905, and in February 1917 was the first bourgeois revolution. Anyway, any effort did not help in avoiding the epilogue of the empire. The Brest-Litovsk Treaty on the 3rd March 1918, signed by revolutionary Russia and the Central Empires, put an end to the war, but represented also a break with the European powers, the Western powers. On the ideological level, this break was marked by the decree about the land to peasants and the abolition of the private property. So it was the birth of a new state, of an ideological state. The birth of the Soviet Union, which was named USSR in 1922, was a novelty, was a political phenomenon in the European tradition, and this novelty forced the Bolsheviks to deal with domestic politics and leave, for the moment, any attempt at territorial expansion. From its beginning, the Bolshevik leadership aimed at strengthening the power and at eliminating the so-called enemies of the revolution, replacing the old empire with a new one, which inherited from the Tsarist empire the system of concentration camps that were existed already in the Tsarist empire, but the Bolsheviks enlarged, of course, to defend the territory, the order, we talked about the order yesterday, the control of the borders, and to defend, first of all, the revolution. And inherited also repressive method, the repressive methods used by the Tsarist system, transforming the regime from an authoritarian one, into a totalitarian one. After Lenin's death, it's important to underline that among the contenders, Bakunin, Trotsky, and Stalin, was Stalin, the commissioner for nationalities, to emerge. It's important because Stalin was the leader, was the man who perfectly knew the relation between the empire and the nations, the nationalities inside the empire, hundreds of nationalities that they had to repress, to control, to maintain the power. Even Stalin, interested in consolidating the Soviet state, gave a little importance to foreign policy at the beginning and to plans of expansion of the socialist state. Many scholars agree on the defensive character of Stalin's geopolitical doctrine. Only after consolidating the revolutionary state, Stalin aimed at enlarging the Soviet borders and at expanding the communist model in other states. According to me, the defensive approach of foreign Stalin's policy changed gradually through a series of bilateral agreements with other powers, among which the Molotov-Ribbentrop Pact in August 1939. This pact definitely changed the balance reached in Europe after the Versailles peace. And it changed this balance in favor of Nazi Germany. This is fundamental. The alliance between Germany and USSR broke when Stalin asked Hitler some Turkish ports on the Black Sea and the Strait of Bosphorus and Dardanelles. This was an area of interest of the Nazi Germany too. So Hitler understood that the question of the Soviet Union, it was an important question to solve attacking the Soviet Union in June 1941. Because this request by Stalin demonstrated that the Soviet Union wanted to reach through the Black Sea, the Mediterranean area. So we can see how the foreign policy continues the objectives of the Tsarist policy. Part of the historiography, first the Soviet and then Russian, continued to maintain a theory according to which Stalin's foreign policy choices were made as a sheer reaction to challenges in the region, which goes from the Adriatic Sea to the Persian Gulf. First, challenges coming from Germany, and later coming from the USA and Great Britain. According to others, Stalin's foreign policy was formed during and immediately after the Second World War and was dictated by Stalin's personal ambitions, which were reinforced by the victory over Nazi Germany. During World War II, the Soviet Union sustained, for instance, this is an example how an empire acts to maintain order and to reach a control over other nations or other states, countries. As an example, we have the relation between the Soviet Union and Yugoslavia, who was one of the countries inside the Soviet sphere until 1948. And in numerous meetings held in Moscow during the war and right after the war, with representatives from Belgrade, details of the line of tactics that would be followed by Soviet diplomacy were clarified. The evolution of the Balkan framework was one of the issues touched upon, in particular in Greece and Bulgaria, and above all the situation in Italy, although it was out of the Balkan, but it was in the Mediterranean area. At the beginning of the Cold War, and until 1948, the year of rupture between Stalin and Tito, the year when they started a new era for Yugoslavia, until 1948, became a trusted ally of the Soviet Union. Stalin called Tito the bastion of the USSR in the Mediterranean, and Tito offered Stalin the port of Trieste. In Italy, you know that it was occupied by Yugoslav forces. Furthermore, Russian documents show that the Yugoslav Communist Party became an important ally. 5 minutes, okay, thank you. I'm finishing. An important ally to influence the Italian Communist Party, at least until 1948. Through the Communist Party and some directives given from Tito, the Communist Party, Miro Togliatti, chose a kind of politics, particularly regarding the territorial question in on the eastern border, that is Trieste, Gorizia, and Friuli-Venezia Giulia. The rupture between Stalin and Tito in 1948 depended on the different ways of conceiving foreign policy. It represents the attempt of Yugoslavs, particularly by Tito, which freed the country with also the help from England, from Great Britain, from money coming from Great Britain, not only from the Soviets. That is, we can remember that the Red Army entered Belgrade and then retired. That is, the Red Army did not stay long in Yugoslavia, like Romania, in Hungary, and so on. So Tito felt free of making some suggestions to Stalin. But it was not the idea, Stalin's idea. So they conceived a different kind of foreign policy. Adventurism, and these are words from Stalin, and the unscrupulous politics of the Yugoslavs towards Italy and Austria aimed at pushing the communist forces to revolt against local governments were not supported by Stalin in that moment. Another problem was represented by the civil war in Greece, erupted soon after the Second World War. Yugoslavia asked Stalin to help the communists against the right-wing government, and Stalin denied. Why? Because this war risked destabilizing the relations between USSR and the Allies, that is Anglo-Americans, and leading to a war which the Soviet Union for the moment was not prepared yet to afford. Later maybe, but not in that moment, in 1947. The Kremlin had all interests in maintaining control of its sphere of influence. For the same reason, Stalin was irritated by Yugoslav rebellion against the empire. That is, Tito tried to suggest a kind of different policy, even to transform Yugoslavia at the center of a new state of southern Slavs. It's very interesting. As we can see, Soviet foreign policy was aimed at maintaining the status quo established at the conferences of Tehran and Yalta. But at the same time, it was directed to find allies, like communist parties, in order to influence internal politics of European states, such as Austria, France, and first of all, Italy. The same can be said about Russia under Putin's guide. I think that we can still talk about the Russian Empire. Of course, it's not an ideological empire, but Putin is trying to recover some values, and some values of the Tsarist Empire, not Soviet. Although they cannot forget about 70 years of a totalitarian regime. As regards foreign policy, the decisions taken, such as the war in Syria and all the proposals made by the Kremlin, show how Putin is interested in becoming a mediator between the West and the East, a sort of hero. And he presents himself, if you watch television, Russian television, as an emperor. When he enters, there are people waiting for him, in wings of people, and he enters the room of the Kremlin as an emperor, as the emperor did. And so he wants to become a mediator between West and East, and between USA and the Arab states, such as Iran and Syria, with whom Russia is allied. The war in Syria represents the will of Moscow to defend Russian interests in the Mediterranean area. As concerns Putin's internal policy, many scholars have called it soft authoritarianism, which, in line with the Tsarist and Soviet policy, is aimed both at maintaining Russian borders, the borders of the new Russian Empire, and to control over nationalities, and at preserving its interests in the Mediterranean Sea and in the Pacific Ocean. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.
There's a story.
Was it time?
No, it's very, very good. I mean, it reminds me of a story. I'm not sure if it's true. It's probably not true. It's too good to be true. Stalin was told that the Red Army had made it to Berlin, and he was depressed. And asked him why.
Yeah.
Alexander made it to Paris. We always have Paris. So, please, Paul.
Yeah, this will be a change of gears. I'm Paul Grenier. Should I stand or sit? Does it matter? Anyway, if I get tired of sitting, I may stand up. But my perspective is, first of all, it's more political philosophical, certainly not historical or political. And even though in principle this leads to Russia, I don't start with Russia. What I've done is, what I'm doing is sharing with you two papers that I've written and synthesized. The first and longer excerpt from the paper was written explicitly for this conference and for its perspective. And in that paper is motivated by the following question. Why is it that in the United States, people are convinced that they are free? It's actually a personal question. I often am startled by the feeling that I don't feel particularly free, and yet if someone asked me, I'd say, well, yeah, I guess I am. So there's this paradox about living in the United States, and I think in liberal countries generally. And my crucial source in this first philosophical portion of the paper is David Schindler's most recent book, Freedom from Reality, The Diabolical Character of Modern Liberty. I then briefly turned to the Russiagate panic, which actually is the overall motivation for this whole project. And what I find, I think, is that Schindler's key insights about liberalism, namely its flight from reality, is helpful and illuminating for understanding the function Russia plays for liberalism in the Russiagate scandal. So anyway, but I start my discussion with Pierre Manent, once again, whose thoughts on Machiavelli complement Schindler's analysis of law. So Manent, in his still untranslated Natural Law and the Rights of Man, says that the importance of politics in Machiavelli's political writings has been much exaggerated. What is central in Machiavelli are his recommendations concerning how to think. Machiavelli's appearance of being concerned about the huge gap between what men actually do and what they should do in the light of conscience is just that. It's an appearance. Machiavelli's fundamental point is that a leader should altogether forget about this gap between what we do and should, and instead is to focus entirely on the matter of effectiveness, a theme that's come up already very interestingly in other papers. So the leader who would act effectively must not allow law or conscience to get in the way. Effectiveness, henceforth, is to be conceived as autonomous. So now, an autonomous effectiveness is something bizarre and new and, I think, ominous. In fact, what it heralds is a break with politics in a traditional sense of the word. Pierre Manent frames this distinction. I think it's feedback, actually. By contrasting the agent who acts and is therefore guided by an end from the theorist or technician whose style of action, quote, is no longer determined and limited by dispositions and ends, but instead is open to any and every possibility given by the situation. So this new freedom of action creates a new type of actor who's capable of every type of action, every possible action, rather. So this last point reinforces for Manent the impossibility of deriving a genuine politics from Machiavelli, because the genuinely political agent always acts in a certain direction commanded by law, in at least some analogical sense of the word law, if not explicitly the law. It might be the law of good architecture. Machiavelli's abandonment of politics in this proper sense of the word has had a crucial impact on subsequent liberal political practice. Having liberated us for endless possibilities, and having also liberated us from natural law and its limitations, law itself now stands in need of a replacement, one which Machiavelli offers to us without hesitation. In the new political order, the post-Machiavellian, quote from Manent, fear, properly applied, will advantageously substitute for the law. Now on law. And we turn now to Schindler's argument. What does Locke have in common with Machiavelli? For both thinkers, action loses its prior, it was formerly thought necessary and natural relation with a specific end, or telos, appropriately. So for Aquinas, as for Aristotle, and Schindler is here translating the classical potency-act relationship into contemporary language, the phrase "I am able" naturally, organically requires a complementary what it is that I am able to do. For example, I am able to play the piano. What is more, traditionally speaking, it is the second part of the phrase, the actuality, that has priority in the order of existence and causation. For the modern thinkers, however, the word able now suffices, rendering actuality secondary at best. For Machiavelli, this same reordering was just expressed in terms of pure possibility and effectiveness. For Locke, it is expressed by power, the power that simply is freedom and the will for law, and ever since. Will is a power open to every possibility, but formed by none. Lockean will takes the shapeless form of an I am able, period. On the one hand, this appears once again to create endless possibilities, which would appear to imply great freedom. But Locke's radical departure for Schindler points in quite another direction. A freedom so conceived is defective in two senses. It is detached from the good, and it is detached from reality. Lockean freedom, which is also, I think obviously, quintessentially American freedom, has a chimerical quality, another concept that's come up already, and a hypnotic power, which at once convinces the mind of its own freedom while effectively depriving it of the same freedom in actuality. And that's a very remarkable feat. And the question is, how does Locke pull this off? Here it gets a bit complicated. So try not to fall asleep. The will for Locke, as we have already noted, is a power. But is the will free? This question poses a dilemma for Locke. Freedom and the will are no longer, for him, connected to actuality, as potency or act or ability was to something actuality like piano playing. They are now simple powers. The will is a power, freedom is a power. This means that to call the will free is to attribute a power to a power, which is not very helpful. It requires splitting the will into two things, one acting on the other, which creates the problem of infinite regress. What the powers, I'll explain why it works that way. The thing is that since Locke has defined the will as a power, and a power by definition is a force that acts on something else, as in the mechanics of nature, so therefore human will conceived as a power necessarily calls to mind the question, well, where does the causal chain begin? Mechanistically. If, on the other hand, the causal impulse for the will is something located outside of me, then how am I free? Because freedom for Locke is autonomous self-movement. The effective source of every action for Locke is my sense of uneasiness, which imperiously impels me to act. So what makes an action free is my ability to negate this action, impelled by uneasiness, wherever it may come from. And that's the Lockean power to suspend. So in every case, we can veto an action, as it were, that is impelled by this uneasiness. So if we can say no to, or suspend acting on an apparent necessity, that suffices to make an action free. So why is this interesting? It's interesting because freedom's essence is now negative. Such a freedom whose only requirement is that we do not say no to our actions, the double negative, is compatible with almost anything. Lockean freedom means that, quote, I am simultaneously a pure product of external causes, which create these uneasiness, for example, in my will, and at the same time, I am the unassailable master of my own fate, perfectly free, because I could always say no to this action on my uneasiness. So freedom, so conceived, again, is essentially reduced to a subjective feeling, and to that extent, is perfectly, quote, is perfectly compatible with any objective circumstances. It's compatible with the soulless machinations of bureaucratic institutions. It's compatible with all sorts of Machiavellian, political and market manipulations of the society. Within the psychological and spiritual framework of liberalism, the individual is still able to assure himself or herself in all such situations, nonetheless, that I am free. Indeed, freer than anyone before, as Americans are constantly ensuring, because of this negative concept of freedom. So if liberalism is an empire, whether analogously or not, it has to control not only our minds, which I think arguably it does, as I've hopefully demonstrated. It has to also build political institutions, and it does so. And the political order of liberalism does so by enshrining freedom through the medium of rights, as I think is clear. The liberal right, as understood both by Manet and Schindler, is in principle unlimited and undefined. As the famous recent Supreme Court case, Planned Parenthood versus Casey, in 1992 put it, each of us has the right to, quote, define our own meaning of the universe. The unlimited right, extent of this right, accentuates and in fact defines this same right's essential meaninglessness. The right, my right to define the meaning of the entire universe, cannot in principle be operable unless it is real only for me, at best. Arguably not even that for me, because of the nature of the world. Yeah. So again, we find ourselves face to face with something that is compatible with virtually any objective order in the liberal understanding of rights. After all, no matter what oppressive bureaucratic or profit-making machinery defines the actual structures of my life, I still have the right to define my own meaning of the universe. At the same time, as Menend insistently emphasizes, the political order in the form of the liberal state serves no purpose but to protect these rights, which on the other hand have no political resonance, and which, and here I'm picking up on Schindler's theme, are simple powers. The rights themselves are simple powers devoid of any concrete reference beyond their being powers. That's what right is in the modern concept. So justified by the expansion of the sphere of rights and freedom, justified by that expansion, the political order, now in the person of the liberal state, seeks to expand without limit the effectiveness of the state, which requires the unlimited increase of its power. What we have described, I believe, simply is liberal empire. And it is certainly the American empire. And returning to the first theme, if you wish to change it, you have to recall that it has at its disposal a powerful mechanism, which it inherited from Machiavelli. Now, that's the theory. Now what I want to do is very quickly, and really just a page, read to you an excerpt adapted from my other paper, which I have a rather extensive paper on the whole Russia panic. And I've pulled out from that just a very small portion, which I think is illuminated by what we've just heard. So we know that the United States, I'm claiming, is founded on the idea of freedom conceived as power, a power to choose any possibility. But this very conception dissociates freedom from any concrete good. But here's the problem. How does such a society assure itself of its own essential goodness, as the United States constantly does, almost obsessively? Nor is that the only paradox confronted by a liberal state. If political order simply is a contest between competing wills, and what else can it be if will is simply a power? To the extent that an ever-present state of war continuously boils just under the surface of society, the state of nature is always there with Hobbes and Locke, really. How is national community even to be conceived, much less maintained? At moments of crisis, this very question moves from the realm of theory directly into the realm of practice. And a case in point can be found in a foreign affairs article recently written by Jeff Hogan and, more importantly, Robert Keohane, arguably one of the deans of American international relations theory at Princeton. The election of Donald Trump, Hogan and Keohane write, has exposed deep divisions within American society, divisions which cannot be ignored without endangering the nation. These deep divisions in the United States, Keohane and his co-author continue, have been caused by liberal globalization and the failure of American elites to properly care for the millions of Americans who suffered from it. To restore America as a community, Keohane says, quite explicitly, we need an enemy. A good enemy is very useful for America, as was evident from the experience of the First Cold War with the USSR. Quote, the fall of the Soviet Union removed the main other from the American political imagination and thereby reduced social cohesion in the United States. End of quote. America needs to develop, quote, a national narrative broadly backed by elites across the ideological spectrum about who we are, one built around opposition to authoritarianism and illiberalism, close quote. Note, last part. Keohane does not call on the United States to oppose illiberal states because they present a threat a direct threat to us or any threat at all. He doesn't even name the country. The threat flagged is that of the United States' internal fragmentation. Obviously, Keogh, being a neo-realist, believes that there's some threat from any great power, as is a given the anarchic nature of the international system from the neo-realist perspective. All the same, his article makes clear that, at least in this case, the enemy has a purely instrumental value. It's a secondary matter, precisely which, quote-unquote, authoritarian enemy is chosen. For the moment, obviously, it is Russia, to help create unity and a healthy, quote-unquote, national narrative. Only opposition can create unity in a liberal society. But these two notions, unity and community and opposition, stand in direct contradiction to one another. So liberal community, like liberal freedom, is divorced from reality, as is, incidentally, almost the entirety of the Russiagate narrative. Thank you.
So what's breathtaking is the diagnosis of deep cohesion of American society, which, according to liberal Professor Cohen, is solved by finding an external enemy rather than addressing a socialist.
And talking about flight from reality.
Please.
Well, my paper follows on from, I think, marvelously from what we've just heard. There's many shadows. My paper, as you see, is the shadow of empire, China, Russia, and an anti-hegemonic alignment. So lots of shadows. We've heard earlier about the Russian Empire as a shadow, the so-called Soviet Empire, and including the Soviet bloc, as well as the ideological empire of communism, revolutionary socialism, and so on. And so the shadow of empire, it's many books in Russian called Sumeriki, Imperia, and so on. The shadow of empire constantly haunts the post-communist political imagination in Russia, very strongly so. Usually couched in terms of some sort of move from Soviet messianism to forms of traditional Russian utopianism, one form we talked about that earlier. Embedded utopianism, in a sense, is embedded in Russia itself as a project, a nation itself as some sort of mystical entity. But in all of this, there's another sort of shadow going on, and that is for the last, both the post-Cold War years since 1989 and indeed the post-war years. Is this endless term post-war, post-communist, post-Cold War, and this endless postism. And by definition, when you have a post, you're constantly referring to what went before. And in that sense, this is the shadows I particularly wanted to emphasize. And for many years, we kept saying, well, okay, it's all post, but what comes next? We now know what comes next. We're now in it, and what we are in is the second, what I call the second Cold War. That's it. So instead of all those exciting achievements of liberal international order, rules-based order, etc., it is the opposite. It is back to where we were before, a post-Cold War, a second Cold War. I won't go into detail of that, but just to say this has enormous consequences for political action. The pattern of world order is changing, and it's been changing since since 2012, 2014, with the Ukraine crisis in particular. The stasis, the word I want to use, stasis of the stability or the perpetuation of institutional ideological forms since 1945 has been astonishing in various manifestations, but there has been a strong continuity. We're now moving, in my view, from stasis to dynamic, a more dynamic system. Some people see it as a new world disorder, chaos, and all the rest, with the language of the catechon to hold that back. And certainly Putin himself, quite explicitly, the debate in Russia is of Putinite Russia as the catechon who is holding back the disorder generated by the so-called US-led liberal international order, which of course generates conflict, disorder of the sorts we've just heard about. So it's in that sort of framework where there's a lot of shadows going on. Now, the context of all of this is, stasis is far more than stagnation, but the framework is what went wrong at the end of the Cold War. And I argue that we're in the framework today is the clash of new world orders. Two New World Orders were on offer at the end of the Cold War, 1989. That's a symbolic date, of course. The first New World Order is the one which was explicitly used, using the actual term. New World Order was put forward by Gorbachev. He used the term at his famous speech in the United Nations in December 1988. He said there's a New World Order full of idealistic talk, full of the language of how we can now work together, how these institutions can actually begin to work in a cooperative way. And so he used it, of course, his famous speech a few months later at Strasbourg, where he talked about a common European home. All of this, I can have elsewhere at great length, but simply to say, well, let's call it New World Order 1. So the Gorbachevian vision, New World Order 1, was based on the idea of transformation, that everybody was going to change, including the historical West. That the idea was, and this is something which remains to this day, this was Gorbachev's idea, it was Yeltsin's idea, and it still is Putin's idea, that as a result of the end of the Cold War, which isn't just the end of a geopolitical and geographic sense, it was also the end, the historical reconciliation of those divisions generated between left and right in the French Revolution. So it was the end of a whole historical epoch in which visions of human transformation, of radical socialism and so on, would be reconciled to forms of capitalist modernity. But that the idea was that this existing capitalist modernity, just as the geopolitical framework of the Cold War, both would be transformed. So New World Order 1 has a number of elements, including an ideological transformation and a geopolitical transformation, at the heart of which was the idea that the historical West would change by the subsumption not just of Russia, but all the post-Soviet states and more, and that the historical West would be transformed to become a greater West. That was the term, but that was what was actually explicit on offer. It would be a logic of transformation. So this is New World Order 1. New World Order 1, which was that the logic was transformation, a mutual, and so the deep philosophical underpinning of it all was, hopefully they'll come out and tell us this piece about the dialogical politics from Bakhtin, with Mikhail Bakhtin, which in Bakhtin's representation of dialogical politics, it's endless. As you know, he's an expert on Dostoevsky. And if I'm sure you've all read Dostoevsky novels where the characters talk and then talk a bit more. But as a result of all this talk, dialogue, they change. It's dialogical. This is Bakhtin's argument, it's dialogical change, that all the actors change. This is the core principle of New World Order 1. It's a dialogical process in which everyone changes by engaging with each other. So it isn't a relationship of pupil and student, or to pupil and teacher, master and slave, as Hegel would put it. But it was a dialogical relationship, a transformation of the very actors. Russia would then engage with this historical West, and indeed, very specifically, why I stress the greater European idea was that Russia would engage with the European Union and other institutions, and that a greater Europe would be established. No one, for a moment, underestimated the enormous difficulties and the establishment of genuine equal free citizenship in Russia, which still hasn't been fully achieved, and so many other achievements. But the idea that it would be done within a framework of dialogical relationship. Plenty of excellent books explaining why the relationship with Russia and the European Union has failed so catastrophically. Grozerov, for example, talks precisely. It was a tutelary relationship. The European Union set itself up as a teacher. And that is precisely repudiating the logic of the end of the Cold War, is that it would not have that. That's the whole point. It's dialogical rather than axiological to say, we know and you it looks like. So that's the tension. So that was New World Order 1. On the other side, you had New World Order 2. And New World Order 2 was an absolute explicit repudiation of New World Order 1. And George H.W. Bush first used that term, New World Order, not in a speech to Congress and so on. It was in a speech in Mainz. And it was, at this time, late 88, early 1989, and it's in the memoirs of George H.W. Bush and Brent Scowcroft, advisor, at that time, which was, hang on, look, this these perfidious Soviets, perfidious Russians, they're seizing the international agenda. We've really got to do, and they say explicitly, we've got to do something about it. We, that is the empire, if you want to call it that, the Atlantic system, the West, has to do something. We have to seize back the initiative. And this is when George H.W. Bush came up with the idea of a Europe whole and free. So Europe whole and free is an explicit slogan of New World Order II to challenge the ideology of New World Order I, which was transformative. And at the heart of the ideology of New World Order II is enlargement, expansion. We have got the center, we're the center, we're the empire of knowledge, of civilization, classic relationship. You are the barbarian, you are to be tamed, the periphery is to be brought into sort of mechanisms of control and so on and so forth. So while we would say, who possibly could be against Europe whole and free? But once we embed that concept in the context of an enlarging New World Order II, you suddenly realize it's the exact opposite of what it should be. It's a missionary idea of teaching the civilized, the barbarian and so on, and the logic of enlargement then plays out. It's an axiological relationship rather than a dialogical one. And obviously, a country like Russia is going to resist it, and it becomes, because it doesn't accept this New World Order II, it becomes designated the spoiler, the source of all evil, and Putin then represented as Darth Vader, and many other nasty pieces altogether. So that's sort of one of the frameworks. The other one, for me, is, how do we make sense then of the international system? I'm not going to solve that in 5 minutes now, but I would say that the international system is a two-level system. The international system at the top, and this is drawn from English school thinking, at the top you have those institutions of global governance. The United Nations, World Trade Organization, and an ever more ramified environmental and financial, of course, developmental, UNICEF, and all the rest. Just heard today, didn't we? The United States is cutting its budget subventions to the UN by 40%, leaving whatever UNICEF and all the other stuff. So that's right. So it's, at the top, you have all of this. And my argument is that this top level of the United Nations at its heart, but all of those, what English school would call second institutions, do not belong to the West. This is one of those conceits of the New World Order II, is to believe that the liberal international order in somehow owns these institutions of international global governance, rather than what New World Order I would say, we're all shared in making these. And of course, this latest book is by Chris Rhodes-Smith and Tim Dunn, which is not the enlargement of international society, but the globalization. Go back into history, 500 years. I mentioned yesterday about Chinese thinking feeding into it. So in other words, this top level of global governance, which of course, no one is suggesting it's anyway coming up to become a global government by any means. But nevertheless, this top level exists, and it is the patrimony of all of humanity. So that, in a sense, is an idea belonging to New World Order I, that these things are a common endeavor which we work together. New World Order II, precisely, doesn't like that because it says we are the only embodiment of order. And therefore, those institutions like the United Nations only exist to the degree to which they are part of the New World Order II, the dominance of an Atlantic system, the so-called historical West. So this is, but at the second level, the under level, it isn't just states. There's a big literature beginning to say that there's now a multi-order world. Our former colleague Kent Trina Flockhart talks about a becoming multi-order world. Amitav Acharya, who's written a vast amount of books, but talks about a multiplex world. So it's more than just states. It's a new vision of order, hence New World Order and so on. So we have this tension between enlargement, which is hegemonic. And transformation is an anti-hegemonic project by its very essence. It's to say we can have order without hegemony. That's the key point. We can have order without hegemony. We don't need the US-led liberal international order to have order. We can create it in this two-level system as long as we are committed. And therefore, we have the paradox that Xi Jinping, I know a lot of criticism of him over the last couple of days, at the Davos meeting, not the last one, the one before, he says, China, and it's building on many other speeches, we also are now defending the international economic order. So in other words, the alternative to liberal international order is not just old-fashioned Westphalian Sovietism. That's the whole point. Neither for Russia nor for China. They are they're built into supporting this top level of international society. That's the point. So it isn't a reversion back to old Westphalian internationalism. It's far more than that, it's far deeper than that, and it's far more normative than just simply a reversion to something else. Now, a word about Russia in all of this, we can't escape. I just, clearly, Russia has tried to find, over the post-Cold War years, a way of dealing with all of this. Very briefly, I just simply said there have been 4 phases. The first one, up to the mid-90s, was genuine liberal internationalism, the enthusiasm of the such like, very quickly disappointed, Atlanticism, and so on. The second one was Primakov. Yevgeny Primakov talks about a competitive coexistence, much more old-fashioned Soviet sort of resistance to it, but it was an articulation of the failure to transform and just simply a response to enlargement. The third phase was Putin's, let's stress this, 2000 to 2012, Putin's new realism. It says, we have to find a way forward. Putin is the most pro-Western leader Russia has ever had, and probably will have as a result of the empire, and it will, it's going to be far, far worse. So he, remember 2000, 2001 speeches in the Bundestag in German, inspirational, all within the intellectual framework of New World Order 1. So while Gorbachev personally is excoriated within Russia, his ideas paradoxically live much deeper and much. And then we have Putin comes in 2012, says, Medvedev was an instantiation of and he said, okay, I can't do it, but maybe Medvedev can. But what happens to Libya and all the rest? So 2012, Putin comes back, and Georgia, Putin comes back and says, it's neo-revisionism. Russia today is a neo-revisionist power. What does that mean? They defend the international system. That revisionist power would be out to smash the whole thing. But it's not. They're defending this two-level system of an international system. They're defending it, China, and that's why they're working so well with China to defend that international system. But the neo-bit or revisionism is that they refuse to accept those practices which are tutelary, which are condescending, including the European Union. As many have said, they never negotiate. The European Union doesn't negotiate. It just tells what it should do. You're key, you take it or you leave it. Fair enough. Most people want to join, never you take it. Fantastic. It's fantastic. But it's a process which Russia could. Anybody know it's not going to happen, just as NATO enlargement was going to happen. So this is the framework. I just want to say one other thing, to say, where we are today, and I think in the last second, just simply to say that we have, in a sense, 3 key in this sort of, what you could call, if you like, the second Cold War. We have 3 things going on. We have on the one side the Trumpian thing, which, Trump is not an old-fashioned realist. He's an old-fashioned, like a nationalist realist nationalist, something like this. Yes, within the framework of the deal making and so on. You have that, but more importantly, you have 2 other things going on. You have the other one is that Putin and China are conservative institutionalists. They tend to defend that international societies has developed over the last 500 years. Those rules of war, diplomacy, they're defending diplomacy. Remember that D word? We haven't seen it in the United Kingdom for many years. And Nikki Haley, I think, has made it an art of repudiating diplomacy and so on. So these are conservative institutionalists. They want these institutions to work. But then you have people like others, like I was going to say Michael McFaul, who are basically democratic institutionalists. They believe that the international system is like a demos at home, in which you can govern and change it and transform it. So you have this threefold thing. Trump out there doing his thing, which back to economic nationalism and so on, first. And it's quite healthy in many ways, because it's recalibration, and it means that that New World Order too, which is so, in many ways, dangerous and conflict-generating, including the EU, because it was subsumed into this Atlanticist empire, or the Western empire, and so on. And against its very nature, the European Union becomes a conflict generator, as it did in Ukraine when it blundered in there, because it bought into the democratic institutionalism thing. I've just, for my sins, I've just finished reading Michael McFaul's book. My sins, I must have been grievous, because that book is a tough one. Two-thirds really normal, good stuff, but the other stuff is about this constant sense of, that we are New World Order 2, we are teaching, and there's the barbarian and the other outside. And, Hillary Clinton, of course, was the epitome of all of that. So this was a new form of hegemony, and the alternative, one word, was that Russia, China, and so on are building. Oliver Stunkel calls it a post-Western world. I'm not sure if that's right. I just seem to call it an anti-hegemonic alignment. Russia, China, and indeed the non-aligned movement. India is buying into Indonesia, many other countries. Serbia, they now have a succession of European Union leaders shouting at the Serbians, what do you think? You're defecting from New World Order 2? You want this New World Order 1 idea of transformation, of genuine sharing and so on. What do you think you are? If you want to join the European Union, you've got to have discipline. You had John McCain coming to Bulgaria, telling them, shouting at them, you can't build Blue Stream and so on, as it was in those days, South Stream. So, that's that logic. So in other words, we ended up in a second Cold War. How can we then retrieve those elements of a New World Order 1, which is a genuine transformative equality, building institutions and law on an international level, which isn't the property of any hegemonic power, but the whole international community. Thank you.
Thank you. Let's have 10 minutes of discussion, 5-minute break, and 1, 2, 3, 4.
Just a very quick question for Paul about Russiagate and the notion of opposition as being essential somehow to catalyzing the liberal community. I'm just wondering, why couldn't climate change do that? Or why couldn't the war on poverty? Are you presenting that one needs opposition against some simplistic type of opposition against a particular figure or a particular country?
Okay, let's collect these 4 statements, then we'll have a discussion. Just
a quick question, Richard. Whether rules are embedded in World Order 1 or World Order 2, how are they to be enforced? Neither.
I actually had a very similar question about the extent to which world order would have to have some kind of particular culture that would be kind of diffusing it rather than kind of general.
So the question for Richard, this idea of the New World Order 2, it seems that it's really this shift of power away from the West as a shift eastward to a kind of resurgence of statism in the census and things like that. And a lot of the demographic and economic features of the world is not a shift southward in Latin America, Africa, the Middle East, etc. I mean, that's where the claims of something different in terms of greater attention to social justice, religiosity, etc. It seems the Chinese and the Russian alternatives making the world safe for authoritarianism.
Okay, a couple more brief comments.
Richard, one thing, Richard. I agree with what you said about what you call it, the one solution one.
Transformation working together, establishing
working together. Why it didn't work? Why didn't it work? Well, I'm not sure I agree with the reasons why it didn't work. No, the reason were, first of all, the European Union was in a very weak position. That's one. Yeah. And second, it was the fault. It was the newcomers in the European Union, like the Poles and like the Lithuanians, who our ambassador, Sergio Romano, preached against bringing new missiles on the borders and everything. Nobody listened to him. But he went and preached to the Poles, to the Europeans, not to the Americans. The Americans would, it was a very difficult situation there.
Okay.
And
just a very brief composite question for Richard and Maria Teresa. Is there more of a parallel or a contrast between the beginning of Cold War I and Cold War II, by which I mean containment policy, in 47, for example? Is that relatively less hectoring, more realpolitik than, say, 2011, 2012, with this very in-your-face kind of missionizing beginning to Cold War II, one might argue.
Okay, so brief responses, Maria Teresa, do you want to start?
Yes, thank you for your. It's interesting also the question about missiles and Baltic area. It depends on you. It's explained in Richard's presentation. I think this fact. According to me, as regards the beginning of the Cold War, and crucial was 1947, that year when there was this international aid, the help of America towards Europe, and America, USA attempted also to give this money, this help, this aid to Russia, to the Soviet Union, to Poland, to Czechoslovakia, and they agreed at the beginning, Poland and Czechoslovakia, and Stalin ordered to go back to deny from this aid. In September 1947, at Zlaska Barieva, in Poland, the Comintern was created. The Comintern was the reaction to this politics, American politics in Europe. It was interesting to underline that Comintern, it was different from Comintern. Comintern was the new approach of the Soviet Union towards communist parties, European communist parties. Because the Cold War, although there were also some signs of Cold War in Iran, in Azerbaijan, in some Asian regions, but the center of the war in that moment was Europe. So Stalin meant to create this organism that was a Comintern. And in which it was a very big role was given to Yugoslav, to Kardelj, which made a very interesting discourse against the Italian Communist Party and against the French Communist Party, declaring that they gave their sustain to Badoglio, to the regime, Italian regime after Mussolini, and to de Gaulle in France. Without now Russian documents show that it was an order given from Stalin, this sustain to give to Italian and to the French government. So I think it's crucial for the birth of Comintern and the form the European Recovery Program by USA.
No, we have 5 minutes between. Please, Paul.
Okay, well, I can be, I think, very brief. Thank you for the question. I mean, yeah, I think in a reality-based world, that would be the way to go. But unfortunately, that's not the world that I think we live in. I think the short answer for why we can't make our opposition to poverty or global climate change the opposition is that to take on those tasks is precisely to take on a common task for a common good, which by definition means that you're talking about the commons, not oppositionalism. Whereas if your concept is based on freedom as autonomy, then you're sort of stuck in this framework of opposition. And I think that's as short as I can make it.
Great. Thank you. I'll go reverse order, just a few words on each. This containment question, excellent. Yes, in many ways, I think this, what we're talking about now is neo-containment, and neo-containment of the Second Cold War far worse than the original one. Kennan, of course, always complained about his original definition of containment becoming too militaristic when in fact we meant it something else. But nevertheless, you still got McCarthyism and so on in the old days. Now it's some sort of incorrect anger and rage, as it were, against Russia and against the idea of challenging that enlargement ideology, which enlargement I mean both intellectually, ideologically and physically. So yes, indeed, that's what neo-containment is both of Russia, China and everybody else challenges it. The Poles, etc., are demanding absolutely that. These are very much, you could say, the shadow of empire, very much. That they feared the reproduction of empire, misunderstanding entirely what the end of the Cold War was. Those guys simply perpetuated both the institutional and ideological framework of the original Cold War to see it emerge into full blossom today in the Second Cold War. They never overcame the Cold War. And I keep saying this is why one of those many criticisms of the European Union, instead of overcoming the logic of conflict, all it did was institutionalized it and perpetuated it both in NATO and in EU. And I said peace and reconciliation. I've just been in Romania, and I said, guys, I thought the EU was about peace and reconciliation. You really are even more optimistic. What did you call me? Condemned me yesterday as an optimism. Absolutely. So they imported into this Atlantic system all the pathologies of the interwar years and 100 years and 1,000 years of European conflict. The European Union was not about overcoming these conflicts. All it has done is perpetuate them in new forms and amplified them. The question, excellent question, I'm afraid I don't know the answer to it, because what you've done is you've humbled me, you've exposed me even, is that I was, ultimately, you've made me think, indeed, that ultimately this anti-hegemonic alignment is just a new Easternism, which could be not transcending the logic of the old Westernism, but perpetuating it in new forms. And what you're suggesting is a breakout to a new Southernism, which could be more intellectually and fruitful, and in keeping with the genuine ideology of New World Order I. So you've made me think on that one, and and just one final thing about how to be enforced, because that was it. That's it. Where institutionalism does work, in other words, we could say United Nations global governance to strengthen them. We're not to make global government. We're still talking about this partnership, multi-level order in which there's a balance between states and institutions. Not liberal institutionalism, if you like, but genuine, this new multiplex institutionalism. And it can't work worse than what we have now, in my view. But thank you.